All right, we're recording. Oh, Gina, it looks like you're muted.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gina Parsons-Diamond, the ACRL staff member who works on Project Outcome for Academic Libraries. Before we hear from the Assessment in Action Roadshow hosts, I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick introduction on the Project Outcome for Academic Libraries toolkit. If you haven't signed up for the toolkit yet, now is your chance. It's free, and if you experience any problems at all with the registration process, please feel free to reach out to us at acrl@projectoutcome.org. So if you have heard of Project Outcome before this webinar, just go ahead and click the raise hand icon. We want to see how many people are familiar with the toolkit. All right, it looks like a good number of you, almost half. So what is Project Outcome for Academic Libraries? It's a free toolkit for academic and research librarians, as well as LIS students, and it's designed to help academic libraries understand and share the impact of essential library services and programs by providing simple surveys and an easy-to-use process for measuring and analyzing outcomes. This provides libraries with the resources and training support needed to apply their results and confidently advocate for their library's future. And I just want to emphasize that the toolkit is for everyone, not just people with assessment in their job titles or descriptions. It was explicitly designed to relate to the widest possible range of library services and roles. And the ACRL Project Outcome for Academic Libraries Toolkit is based on a model that was developed and tested by the Public Libraries Association, which has been in the field since 2015. So there are 7 survey topic areas available in the toolkit. These cover a broad range of programs and services that academic libraries provide. And each of these surveys was designed to capture 4 key outcomes: knowledge, confidence, application or behavior change, and awareness. Each survey also contains 2 open-ended questions that help you get the most of your patron feedback. What did they like most about the program, and what can the library do to improve? Based on PLA's experience and the academic experience, these open-ended questions have been invaluable to libraries. This is where they gain the most insight on how to help their patrons and gather qualitative evidence to demonstrate value in the community. So we know that administering surveys and entering data can be kind of a pain, but what makes it worth it is what you can do with the results. In Project Outcome, the results are available in a variety of formats, making it easy to review, interpret, analyze, and share your results. One format is the data dashboards, which show interactive graphic visualizations of your aggregate survey data. And the other form that your data analyzation can take is reports. There are 2 types of reports available in Project Outcome, making it easy to share with other library staff, management, and stakeholders. There's the summary report, which gives you the results of 1 survey and is designed for quick sharing. It's just 1 button you click and you get it. If you wish for a larger report to cover a whole program or survey topic area, you can build a custom report, and that lets you get really granular with what data you are presenting to your stakeholders. So I know that was a pretty quick overview of the toolkit, but I am always here to answer your questions. We also have a peer discussion board, which is available to any user of the toolkit. Thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it over to Project Outcome Editorial Board member, Sue Hunter.
Thank you, Gina, for that introduction and overview of Project Outcome. So my name is Sue Hunter, and I am an academic librarian at the University of Guelph-Humber in Toronto. And I am a member of the Project Outcome for Academic Libraries editorial board. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Assessment and Action Roadshow, 4 years of facilitating library assessment of student learning and success. This webinar is hosted by ACRL's Project Outcome for Academic Libraries editorial board, and it was planned by a subcommittee of the editorial board. And I want to give thanks to my co-webinar subcommittee members, Becky Croxton from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and Jen Arnold from Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina, for the idea to connect with the Assessment and Action Roadshow to establish this webinar. Today's presenters for the webinar are Brandy Whitlock and Sara Lowe. Professor Brandy Whitlock is the instruction librarian for Anne Arundel Community College and also teaches in Dominican University's School of Information Studies program and for the University of Maryland Global Campus. Professor Whitlock is currently the coordinator for the Assessment in Action Roadshow. And Sara Lowe is Associate Librarian and Associate Dean of Educational Services at IUPUI. Prior to that, she was Assessment Librarian at the Claremont College's Library. And Sara has over 10 years of experience with assessment and instruction in academic libraries. So I'm going to pass the screen over to Brandy and Sara now. And please add your questions to the chat and we'll address those at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Sue. Let's see. Yeah, so we'll get into presenter mode here. Brandy is.
I had to unmute myself first. It doesn't let me see my. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go.
So yes, so thank you so much for having us. So I'm Sara, and this is Brandy. And what we're going to do today during our brief time together is take you through the background and rationale for the roadshow, do an overview of the roadshow so you can kind of get a sneak preview of what you would get if you did the roadshow, and finally where the roadshow has been and where it's heading. So here is the group of folks who developed and teach the roadshow, including Brandy and myself. To start off with the what the roadshow is actually trying to do, so thinking about the theory of library impact and value, it's really trying to help folks connect, document, and communicate the work of their library to campus goals, specifically those connected to student success. So next slide. Sorry. To know why the roadshow was developed, it's really important to understand the background and history of assessment in academic libraries. So let me take you through a journey, a macro view of assessment in our profession. So in the early 1980s, ACRL has been interested in accountability and assessment since way back then. And at the time, ACRL created an ad hoc committee on performance measures that developed a manual on assessment, where measures were designed primarily for internal library decision-making, performance assessment, and resource allocation. And it would be fair to say that measurement at this time was really focused on demonstrating library performance against our institutions and benchmarking against peer libraries and institutions. Over the last 2 decades, ACRL and the librarianship has maintained its interest in measurement, but has also evolved, developed new iterations and trajectories for it, specifically determining how the work we do directly supports student learning and success. So in the early 2000s, we could characterize that the time in our profession is having a very nascent assessment culture. Academic libraries still very much enjoyed their status as kind of the heart of the university, although largely they were still viewed in a supporting role, not an active role directly supporting student learning. I apologize, my throat seems exceptionally dry today. Hold on. So while we did satisfaction surveys and counting were still the norm, for evaluating and demonstrating the value of our work, there were calls from within the profession, but also in academia, to demonstrate how the work we do supports the instructional enterprise. So information literacy, for example, was gaining traction in college curriculum with workshops commonly embedded in courses. And we were building important teaching relationships with faculty and feeling that we could make contributions to student learning, but we were left wondering if we could really tell, how we were impacting students' long-term success and learning. This isn't something you can get at with like a satisfaction survey. So as the 2000s progressed, academic librarians, like our colleagues throughout all of higher education, began facing increased external pressures for accountability and an ongoing internal commitment for improvement. And the government and other stakeholders were asking for results, and academics, in contrast, were generally taking a trust us approach, or if pressed, focused exclusively on resources and activities, not really results. But as we all know, higher ed was changing. And so now in the 2010 to the present, ACRL's Value of Academic Libraries initiative is responding to these demands and working hard to position academic librarians as contributors to the campus conversations on accountability and impact. And to that end, there's an increasing recognition of the value of libraries and librarians. And it's one of ACRL's 6 strategic priorities. And recognizing the sense of urgency around the issue, ACRL created the Value of Academic Libraries initiative to help librarians participate in this conversation and to identify resources to support them in demonstrating the value of academic libraries in clear, measurable ways. And this, the Roadshow, is one of the outcomes of this, so that this is a direct correlation then to what the Roadshow does. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Brandy. So folks on this webinar today probably recognize this need to assess our work in new ways and understand the macro imperatives. So right now, maybe you're not in your ideal state. If you're in this webinar, you're probably not, where the library is considered a crucial partner in institutional assessment conversations on student learning and success, and where you have intentional planning discussions with the library on assessment. So our micro level environments impact our ability to launch or fully enact an assessment culture. And there are a bunch of obstacles that you're all probably likely to face. So all the little bubbles here around this little person here are the real voices of past AiA participants. So think, if you recognize yourself or your organization in these comments, that we have an irrational fear of assessment. So maybe colleagues are afraid or skeptical to assess their teaching. There are trust issues there. There might be a legacy culture where assessment is seen as assessment for accountability instead of assessment for improvement. We typically jump into collecting data without first setting why we're doing it. So we don't have conversations about what's truly important to us and then design systems to assess it. We're good at the who, what, when, how of instruction, but not the why. So maybe never taken the time or the resources to systematically examine what we're doing and why to be more intentional. We tend to measure and do what's easiest, not necessarily what we really care about. So recognizing that the question should come first and then design a methodological approach to answer the question, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. And the library should be at the heart of the campus, but we're left out of assessment initiatives. So maybe the library gets overlooked a lot. Maybe it only gets mentioned in operational conversations or talks, but maybe not in a meaningful way. So, sorry. So do folks, well, let me pause for just 1 second, because why not? If folks, Brandy, would you go back to that last slide just for 1 second? Could folks raise their hands if they did see something in here that resonated with them? Yeah, okay. A lot of folks over, yeah, okay. About half of folks, thanks. And I know that even in my institution, you know, it's a struggle, right? It's a constant thing you have to think about. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Thanks, participants. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Brandy. So these issues, these barriers are not just librarians don't just face these alone. They're actually very similar to other professionals across higher ed, including student affairs professionals, where contributions to student learning and development have also been typically overlooked. So there was actually a 2012 study found that there are 3 common categories of barriers to systematic outcomes-based assessment among student affairs professionals. And they're listed here: the lack of resources, a lack of time, and a lack of understanding. So they also cited lack of understanding of student learning theory, lack of collaboration with others, especially faculty, lack of trust, and difficulty managing expectations as barriers. So although the macro environment clearly calls for assessment, enacting assessment isn't without its challenges. Professionals may be overwhelmed or even paralyzed by these commonly shared barriers to outcomes-based assessment.
So before we introduce the outcomes for our roadshow, we think it's important to situate assessment vis-a-vis evaluation and research. And all of these activities fall under evidence-based library and information practice. So it's important to consider the purposes of these different activities. So evaluation is summative, it provides a snapshot, it's process oriented, it's answering the question, what's the quality of what we've produced? You arrive at a judgment at the end, a sort of rating that you might use to compare your work across departments or across institutions, where assessment is really focused, as Sara mentioned, on improvements, right? It's formative, it's ongoing, it provides information about upward and downward trends. It answers the question, are our processes working to produce what we intend? The result of the assessment process is a diagnosis, right? It's identification of the ways that we might improve our processes and their results in our very specific contexts. Assessment is super contextual, where social science research is really about testing theories. And so that's sort of at the far end of the spectrum, and it involves controlled environments, generating data that establish new knowledge or that advance particular theories. And so the optimal result is something that's generalizable, right? And that's not necessarily what we're going to find with assessment. So these distinctions can really be a point of confusion conceptually at maybe your library or your institution. I know at my institution, any of these activities would be considered assessment for any of those student services folks that we were sort of talking about, Sara. Whereas if we're looking at the learning outcomes assessment aspect of it, these would be definitely separate in that kind of silo at my college. So it might be the same with you, where people use these terms interchangeably, or sometimes they don't use them in a way that that you might. But it's important to think about this this sort of these silos and how things fit into them. The closer we get to social science research, the more likely we are to be able to generalize those results, but that kind of rigor is not necessary for assessment. We can gather data that help us to plan and manage and make decisions, but we're not really going to be able to, even with social science research most of the time, establish causality, right? The most we're going to find are relationships. So these are the revised learning outcomes for the roadshow itself. This is what we want participants to be able to do by the time they finish with our roadshow. We've revised slightly. They're not very different than they were before, but we wanted to better reflect what we're able to really accomplish with the roadshow. And the focus of the roadshow, as we've mentioned, is on student learning and success. That's right there in the first bulleted point there. Though much of what we discuss about assessment could be applicable to lots of different kinds of assessment projects or outcomes that are related to library services, collections, programs, etc. But we do occasionally get folks in the roadshow who are like, but what about, that's not, our focus is really on student learning and success. So those other kinds of areas would really be tangentially sort of touched on in our roadshow. So this is something people in our roadshow see a lot. It's the assessment design or the assessment cycle design that we use. And so we take our participants through this 6-step process. We start at the center, connecting our assessment activities with those institutional and library missions and goals and initiatives. And then we work through the process there at number 1 of identifying and articulating those student learning and success outcomes. We establish criteria, that's number 2, that will allow us to say whether our efforts have been successful. We next describe the actions that we'll take to achieve the outcomes, and then we talk about the evidence that we're going to gather that's going to help prove our case. And then we end with analyzing the data we gather and using that analysis to inform and plan for change. We want to make sure that we're using the data that we gather to drive decisions, right, about how to improve the library's learning experiences, our services, our resources, the environments that we offer to our students. So I'm hoping maybe you can type in the chat a little bit and tell us, as you look at this cycle and think about the assessment process in your job or at your institution, where do you feel like things are most difficult for you? Like, which of these sort of steps do you feel like things get sticky, or maybe your bottlenecks? And then do you feel like there's a particular reason maybe that you get stuck? I mean, you don't have to say so. You could just say number 1 or number 4. But if you have a reason that you think might sort of influence why that's maybe a sticky place, please respond in the chat if you would. We'll take a few minutes to take a look at what folks are saying there. Number 4, getting that evidence together. Yeah, I see that. Number 3, figuring out the actions. 5 and 6 can be really tough. So it's all over. We're getting folks from all over getting sticky in places. Okay. Identifying outcomes. Yeah, that can be tough. Especially when it's sort of top down. Identify these outcomes. Thank you so much for your feedback. This is really helpful to see where folks are getting in trouble, in good trouble, right? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I can't look at the chat and my slide at the same time, so I'm gonna close the chat and I'll look at it more later. But thank you so much for your responses and for really thinking about where things might get sticky for you, because I hope that in the next part of our talk, we're going to maybe show you where we might address some of those issues in the roadshow. So first, we look at those institutional priorities. We want to make sure that we're connecting to our campus partners. And so it's really important that we do this work, and it actually is in one of the outcomes for the whole roadshow, and it does thread through all of our work, these connections that we're trying to make. And that's because libraries don't operate in a vacuum, and we want to make sure that our assessment work connects with what matters most on our campuses. The services, programs, and resources that we provide occur within a very specific institutional context, and they're influenced by what's going on at your institution and in higher ed generally. So in the roadshow, we take some time to figure out what's really important on participants' campuses. And so by doing this work, we're able to have conversations with other people across campus. We can make our connections with them explicit, and then that helps us to gain traction. And by gaining traction, what we mean is garner resources. And so it can help us to get help, right, with these projects. We can break down different silos, and obviously we want to be able to position ourselves as a partner on campus with our other educational endeavors. So I'm sure that if you thought about it for just 2 seconds, you might think of like one institutional priority at your college or at your library that might have to do with student retention or degree progress or completion or student engagement, right? These are the common kinds of things we're seeing in a lot of colleges and universities sort of bubble up to the top in terms of our priorities. So next, as part of the roadshow, we connect and align. We help people to connect and align their outcomes, their criteria, those actions, and that evidence. And this is tough. So just to get back to the slides, you can see where we're at. After we've worked through our institutional priorities and goals and how we can connect to those, we then start looking at number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now, connecting all those things. So starting with outcomes, we in the Roadshow's curriculum, we try to help people sort of orient themselves differently. In libraries, we're often oriented toward inputs. So how many items are in the collection, how many instruction sessions you taught, how many items circulated, reference transactions, right? Those are inputs. Those are ways that we show or describe what we're doing to help students learn, right, and be successful. But we need to change that outlook or change that orientation toward outcomes, which answer a different question, right? The question the outcomes answer is what can students do as a result of what they've learned, right? What can they do now that they couldn't do before, or as a result of what we've done for them? So in the Roadshow, we help participants optimize their outcomes so that they're achievable, observable, actionable, meaningful, highly meaningful. So we help people really refine those outcomes and make sure that they're working with something that's going to be workable in their contexts. And then we definitely get into criteria. And when setting up criteria for assessing an outcome, we have to establish what success means. How will we know when we've been successful and students have achieved that outcome that we wanted? It's important really to think about the actions that we take toward realizing that specific student learning outcome or student success outcome, and to articulate those actions so that we can be clear about what it is we can change by virtue of the information that we gather. And then, of course, we definitely get into evidence. Lots of talk about what constitutes good evidence, how we think about data and how we're going to collect it. We need to be able to gauge, right, the success of our actions with this evidence. And so we use that evidence and measure it against our criteria to see if we've achieved those outcomes that we've intended. In the Roadshow, we discuss definitely ways of getting at that most meaningful data and using multiple measures, especially to assess our outcomes most effectively. And just to give you a sense of sort of how this all might come together, here's an example of what would happen if perhaps you were working through the first 4 steps of the assessment process. And so first, let's say we connect an institutional priority like student engagement with an outcome related to library spaces. The outcome might look something like students utilize library spaces for individual study and group projects in order to deepen engagement with curricula outside of their classrooms. So the outcome is stated in a way that describes what students will be doing, right, as a result of the things that we provide them. And so the criteria that we set might be a percentage of, we could set this at a rate that we think is right, of first-year students who indicates on a survey that, for instance, that library facilities enhance their engagement. But of course, we'd want to use multiple measures. We wouldn't necessarily just want one. And so we might try to use that information and correlate perhaps the GPAs of our first-year students with the time they reported spending in the library. That would be another way to get at some of that information. And then we might also utilize some of the data gathering that's already going on at our colleges and universities, like using the SESI or the NESI survey and trying to garner some information from one of those places. And then when we describe the actions that we're going to take in order to achieve those this outcome using these criteria. So of course, we're going to provide relevant space. We're going to develop signage. There's a number of things we can include as actions that we could then change later on. And then the evidence, right? How are we going to collect it? Well, in this case, we're going to need to maybe establish a survey. We're also going to need to partner with our institutional research folks to be able to get at their grades. And maybe, again, with our institutional research offices for information about the results of those larger data gathering tools. So that leads us into analyzing the data and interpreting it. So I'm going to head over to Sara now.
Yes. So the first 4 parts are the meaty part of the assessment cycle, but the last 2 steps are super important as well. And thinking of analysis, so that now we're in kind of step 5. So looking at your results. Next slide, please. There's that kind of I like that. Oh, you can click through. I forgot that this was an active one. Yeah, you can just go through the whole thing. Make it do all. Yeah, there you go. Okay, yeah, thanks. Brandy's doing an excellent job with the slideshow. So really, what we take folks through in the roadshow is, once you've done your assessment, you really need, depending on your results and your data, you'll have several paths depending on which way you go, depending on what results you get. So for example, the first thing here, we should start doing X more because of Y. So say, for example, you have a first-year seminar that your assessment found students were more successful on the final project, Y, when a librarian collaborated with the class, X. So you link more librarians, X, to first-year seminars, right? So depending on the data you get, your path will look different depending on what your data is. And then the next step, the final, well, not final, the last thing before you loop back around. So next slide, please. The final slide, the final step is taking, is taking action and communicating results. Okay, now you can go on to the next one. Thank you. So this final step, again, it's not final, right? Because if you're closing the loop, you're going back around and changing your outcome. So depending on the results you get, you take action on them by changing your outcomes and then going back through the cycle again. But really important to do that, to close the loop, and also to communicate those results. And so there are a bunch of different ways you can do that, right? You want to communicate the results to key stakeholders. So thinking about how you most effectively communicate your results, identifying stakeholders who need to hear your message, determining why the findings matter to them, crafting your message in a way that will get their attention. And then you also need to think of some sort of action. So again, closing the loop on your assessment. So for example, let's use an example of research consultations with at-risk first-year students. So if your assessment findings told you that research consultations improve retention of at-risk first-year students, then you need to decide, right, what are you going to do? How are you going to increase or strengthen what is working well? Perhaps you try to reach more at-risk first-year students through collaborations with other folks on campus, or maybe you decide to expand the consultation service, but obviously that requires more staff. So there's push-pull and things to be thought about at every level. All right, so that then, next slide, please. that then is the cycle. So that's the assessment cycle that we take folks through. So now thinking about the roadshow and, you know, what have we done and where are we going from here? So we have, and I love Brandy for this slide. I think it's an amazing slide with the t-shirt, the roadshow t-shirt, sorry. We've done 20 roadshows to date. We did have a few more that unfortunately got canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But you know, over 700 participants. And I've been this, you know, like this webinar today. So we've really we've reached a lot of different folks with this, with the roadshow. And thinking about how we can improve in order to keep the roadshow content relevant to all participants. We actually regularly do check-ins with this, but in December 2019, we did a pretty big survey with we sent it out to all past AiA participants, asking them these questions. How relevant was it? Have you used any steps of the assessment cycle? What elements were most helpful? What should we work on adding? And based on those results, the main survey takeaways were the hands-on stuff folks really like, the group work, the ability to work in groups, linking the theory to application, folks really like that. And they really like getting that feedback, not only from the facilitators like Brandy and myself, but also the other participants, because you're, you know, kind of getting a community of practice there in the workshop. Some of the recommendations were that so right now it's one full day. Or as it stood before the COVID pandemic, it was one full day. So folks have asked that it maybe a little bit more time or less time. It is a lot to get through in a day. It's a lot of dumping stuff into your brain. Recommendations that we need more through lines. So thinking like case study approach, things like that, where you have examples that you kind of take through the entire process to really help visualize how that all works together. And that some of our examples were too focused on instruction. So those were the main survey takeaways. And now Brandy's going to take us through what we're going to do to address that.
So we are in development of the AiA Off-RoadShow. We are looking, these are our plans. We would like to have the Off-RoadShow facilitated over 2 half-day Zoom sessions. It just feels like way too much to try to get through in one day on Zoom, and we feel like there's opportunities there for reflection and a little bit of, you know, maybe even gathering of information that could happen between sessions that could really impact the effectiveness of the roadshow. So we're looking forward to thinking through how we might do these 2 half-day sessions. We're imagining them no more than 7 days apart, I think, right? So a week apart, but maybe even in shorter intervals, if that makes sense for folks who want to bring the roadshow online to them. We want to be able to include more engagement before and after the roadshow. And as Sara was mentioning, we're going to integrate case study work into our curriculum. And then there are 2 sort of big ideas around assessment that sort of bubbled up from the facilitators, you know, having our sort of ear to the ground in assessment circles. So we felt there were places in our curriculum that sort of needed beefing up. So as a result of you know, sort of being informed by what the facilitators know about the current assessment environment in higher education, we want to make sure to look at those places where equity, diversity, and inclusion work and assessment work intersect, right? We want to look at those intersections. And we want to definitely look more at the ways in which data privacy usage and management are affected and affect assessment. So we're hoping, you know, off-RoadShow sounds so much fun, like it's going to be so much fun, like we're going to go like 4-wheeling or something. But this is more online. So we're hoping to announce by around ALA in June, that our roadshow is ready for people to book. So that's where we're at right now, and we're through pretty fast, Sarah and I, and so we have lots of time for your questions and your comments. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, Brandy and Sarah, we have a few questions that have cropped up that I can sort of review in case you can't scroll back in the chat. First of all, who is the ideal audience for the roadshow? Seems like this is at the practitioner level. How can we engage library administrators in assessment? Ideally, they are already, but sometimes they are not.
Yeah, so we've had administrators come
Yeah, we
to
have. Yeah.
to our sessions, and some of them I think didn't get a lot out of the process, but a lot of them, I think their eyes were sort of opened a little bit to how much work, how much knowledge, how many sort of connections you need to make across campus, how deep and wide this work goes. And I feel like for perspective in that way, it can be very useful for administrators, but they don't find the actual hands-on work, I think, as useful as you're sort of picking up on the practitioners. Sarah, did you want to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it maybe depends too on how big or small your organization is, because sometimes the admin is a little bit more, because I did one roadshow, I remember distinctly, and there was an administrator there who clearly, like, he was really engaged with it and really got and was connecting it to things. So it kind of, I think it depends on, motivation, level of engagement, I guess.
Yeah, and size, and sort of, at what level the administrator is, right? The administrators who are closest to this work are going to be probably most engaged, where the administrators, farther away, and that just depends on the size and the organization, right, of your institution. So I hope that answers your question.
Sure, thank you. So next, do you deliver the roadshow to groups of different institutions? For example, if we could bring together several of the 2-year and 4-year in our regional area, could representatives from all institutions participate in the roadshow?
Definitely. We've done roadshows for statewide institutions. So the ACRL chapter, right, for your state or your local, your region. We've done roadshows for a sort of consortium of community colleges in a particular state. We've done them for just other kinds of groups who sort of pull their resources together and bring us in. Am I forgetting anyone, Sarah?
No, but I would say, so the way we group things up and what we'll try to do on the off-road show too is, like, some folks can get together with like affinity group, right? Like you're in the same type of situation, so you chat with other folks. But I have seen real benefit too from those different groups cross-pollinating, getting ideas from each other that they maybe wouldn't have thought of.
Definitely. Yeah, so definitely we work with institutions sort of pulling their resources, whether it's through consortia or your ACRL chapters or your library, like we did one for all the libraries in the Maryland university system, or all the libraries in a particular university system.
All right, next, just to reassure everyone, you will receive the recording of this session. A couple of practical things. The cost, how much does it cost to bring the roadshow to us? And then what will the off-roadshow pricing look like?
So we're still kind of working some of that out, actually. When we were meeting in person, we had a sort of participant facilitator ratio that we worked with. So if you were to invite up to 40 participants, you would need 1 facilitator. If you were to invite up to 100, you would need 2. So it depended a little bit on that. And so we're thinking those numbers might need to come down a little bit for online, just because it just takes more time to facilitate online. And we want to make sure everyone's able to get that feedback that we know is really valuable to people. So we're looking into pricing a little differently based on that. But normally it would include a fee, and I'm so sorry, I don't know what that fee is. Sarah, do you know what the fees were?
Oh, not off the top of my head. I apologize. COVID has wiped everything out of my
Yeah.
brain.
We don't really deal with the business end as much, except for, of course, our expenses. When you bring someone to campus for the roadshow, in addition to the fee, you do pay for the.
Thank you. Yes, I would. Yeah, some of the cost, I saw someone posted the cost. Some of them got taken offline with COVID because they weren't being offered regularly, and so it's not as accessible as it was to find that. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump over you, Brandy.
No, I'm afraid to say I don't know how much it costs, and we're not quite sure yet. But there are different tiers of cost given how many participants you invite. That's important to know.
Yeah, but with the off-road show, obviously there would not be the expense of bringing a facilitator too. So you would wipe out that cost, which was around $1,500. So that would be gone.
That's right.
Oh no, wait, yeah, because it's yeah. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so thanks to Gina for putting the link in the
Thank you.
chat. And I think that will also address a question about how can we sign up. I think all of that information is probably included there.
Yeah.
Question about does the dashboard connect with surveys in real time? I think this might be a question for the project outcome in academic libraries.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm getting that correct, yes. The surveys are connected in real time and the data is updated in real time. So another question for Brandy and Sara, how could this benefit small seminary college libraries? You may already have addressed that with your previous answer, but I'm not sure if there's something else you'd like to add there.
Take it away, Sarah.
Well, I think any library can benefit from it, even if it's just thinking about how you can start to develop, but maybe a more intentional assessment culture. And obviously, no institution is really immune from the pressures of higher ed and that kind of stuff. So. And even if you don't even think about it from an accountability, like you have to make your case for why you should get funding this year from your administration, just the learning the best practices of how to do assessment is super helpful, because then you can be more intentional and meaningful with your resources. And, thinking of a small library, obviously more limited resources than other folks.
That's super good point. And yeah, none of us can escape accreditation, hopefully, because the accreditation process does generally require some acknowledgement and evidence of your assessment work. And it does. So people get a little confused about this, and they think, oh, so the assessment body wants to see my data, and they don't really care about the data. They want to see, they want evidence of the assessment process, that you're using data to drive or inform your decisions. And so even at small libraries and small academic institutions, it's really important that you be able to provide that evidence of that process. And as Sarah said, assessment doesn't have to be huge and sort of cross campus. It can start pretty small. It can start in one class or in one part of the library, one space. And as you build that repository of data, it becomes richer and richer. And so even starting small, you end up getting over time data that can be very meaningful, even if that one snapshot isn't terribly meaningful in that one moment. As you add to it and think about it and expand it, you're able, I think, to get a lot of useful data that drive and inform your decisions. So scaling your assessment to the smaller institutions, I think, is going to become more and more a part of the work that we do.
And there was a question about, I'd like to see more examples of tying outcomes to institutional goals, as you did in the presentation with space utilization. So I'm not sure if there is a resource for that.
It's our roadshow. We have lots and lots of examples in the roadshow. In fact, we over develop that area so that we can choose examples that are going to be most relevant to the folks that we're to the specific folks that we're using and that we're facilitating the workshop for. So so if it ends up that we're working at some small liberal arts colleges, or we've done medical folks at medical libraries, right, we might choose examples of those institutional priorities different, and then our examples would be different based on those contexts that we're working in. So we have lots and lots of great examples of that, and folks, I think they got we did get sort of some feedback about wanting examples other than instruction. And we do provide some examples of, embedded librarians and instruction sessions, and assessing around those kinds of activities. But we also present information around assessing reference services and assessing peer tutoring and space and other kinds of library services and environments and resources that relate to student learning and success. So we try to give a lot of examples.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. How do we get over the fear of assessment? What's the easiest way to begin?
Well, I'll speak from my, so sorry, I don't want to jump in, Brandy.
No, go, Sarah, you're good at this.
Well, no, the main thing, so I have an instruction I come from class instruction background. So my thought always is like thinking about a fear of assessment is just, as Brandy said earlier, you start real small, right? Like maybe just, you add in an end of class evaluation, or like project outcome, you add in that survey to one class. And just kind of get used to it and start to think it. But then as you become more comfortable with it, then you can kind of build that out. But really, it's just diving in and understanding that the data will never be perfect. It will never be 100%. It will, but that having some data helps you make change. Like, so if I do a survey and at the end of a class, that can help me determine how I can modify my teaching then for the next time I teach that class, right? And if students have, kind of learned what I was trying to teach them. So even that little bit gives me something that I can then build on for the future.
That's so important. And I would add to that, I think one of the ways to help people get over the fear of it is to show them all the ways they're already doing it. So as Sarah was mentioning, if you're a good teacher, you're already doing assessments, right? You're already rethinking your assignments and your learning materials and even your outcomes, right? As you get data, right? As you see students' grades, or as you see the responses that you're providing to them on their work. And so by pointing out to folks, well, you're already doing so much of this. Assessment practice at your institution now is just asking you to document it, right, in ways where maybe you haven't before. So especially around learning, I feel like that's one way that you can go. But it's kind of a valid fear in some ways, because folks have been kind of burned sometimes where they've been asked to do assessment. And assessment is about pointing out places for improvement. If you're doing assessment and all you're finding out is that you're great and wonderful and everything's gone right, then you're probably not doing it right. So sometimes folks get scared because it's going to point to places where they're not meeting expectations, or where they're not feeling like they're living up to their potential, or whatever that might be, right? Places where you could improve, which implies some sort of problem. And so, and occasionally that has been used against folks when, in ways that it shouldn't. And so some of it is confusing, that evaluation with assessment, because the assessment we're supposed to be focused on, in assessment, we're supposed to be focused on improving our practice, and that requires a kind of vulnerability, right? So I get it, why that can happen, but I think part of helping people get over that fear is just acknowledging it, and then helping people work through the process so that it becomes clear that what we want for them is to be able to get meaningful information that helps them. That at the end of the day, that's what the assessment process is supposed to give you, and that shouldn't be scary at all.
That's great. Thank you. There was a question about connecting, again, I think this is for Project Outcome, a way to connect surveys from a third party, such as Google, to the data dashboard, and that no, it's not possible. And Gina, correct me on that if I'm wrong. And then there was a question about, do you have promotional material that could be shared with college administration? So I wonder if that might come through the link that Gina provided for the roadshow.
I don't know if it's really geared toward administrators, though. That might be something we take back to our group. I think the promotional materials are mostly for, to describe what we're doing for the people who want to attend, but it's not necessarily, we don't have necessarily something that's geared to the folks who would permit attendance, right? So or require or encourage attendance. So that's something I'll put in my notes, and we'll think about how to maybe work out some of those materials for folks for the future. Great question.
And then there is a question about the group rate. Is there a special pricing? ACRL will define a group as up to 30 individuals from a single institution working remotely and logging in individually from multiple locations to participate in a live webcast. Does that mean that a group of institutions can't do a group rate, or will there be special pricing for that?
I can answer that question. This is Gina. The group rate that you're referring to is for publicly available paid webinars and e-learning. If you're interested in hosting a private e-learning webinar, you'll just want to get in contact with us for special pricing. The group rate applies to e-learning where anyone can sign up and pay.
Thanks, Gina, for the clarification. And how can we keep informed about the Off-RoadShow?
So the link that you were provided will probably be the best way to keep informed about that. And hopefully we'll be able to give more promotional materials and other kinds of information to folks around ACRL in June. So maybe just be on the lookout around then for some information.
Okay, perfect. And then just a comment to support developing promotion geared towards administrators, as you were outlining. There seems to be more support for that to be helpful.
It's a great idea. We'll work on that.
It is, yeah. Thanks for the suggestion.
So I think that brings us to the end of the questions, and 1 minute left in our webinar time. So I just want to take this moment to thank Brandy and Sara very, very much for sharing this insightful review of the Assessment and Action Roadshow and how it works to facilitate library assessment of student learning and success. And thanks to all of you for adding your questions. I think it was a good learning process for us also.
Yes, thank you so much for being here and for your participation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.